we didn't talk about where Satan came from because we don't necessarily know. We know some things. What we know more about Satan is where he's going, right? We know a lot more from the Bible of where Satan is going. We don't know so much about where he came from. So then last week, we talked at length about what Satan isn't. And I'm not going to remember all of them, but he's not omnipresent, he's not omniscient, and then the third one that omnipotent. I can never remember that one. He is not any of those things, and we talked about those things in detail. This morning, we are going to talk a little bit more about where Satan comes from. And I'm going to tell you now, like I said last week, we've got a little bit of scripture to go off of here, so I'll offer you the scripture that we have. I'll give you some conjecture along with some things proposed by this curriculum in here. It'll sort of be a mixture, and there's not a whole lot here. And then as I mentioned to Anita just a moment ago, Dottie just basically pulled an all-nighter, so I'm tired. Obviously, my wife and baby are not here because they are tired. So I don't have a ton here. So if you want to discuss with me, I think that'd be great. But we are going to talk about and deal with the question, where on earth did Satan come from? And we all know who Satan or the devil is, the adversary. And for some of us, we've kind of heard of the devil before we heard of Jesus or about Jesus. Maybe not necessarily God, but a lot of us have heard about Satan or the devil before we heard about Jesus, right? There's sort of this, I don't know, depending on what kind of parents you had, but you better be good, or, the boogeyman is going to get you, or you're going to be punished in some way. So where did Satan come from? This extreme, what feels like just this extreme source of evil. Where does Satan come from? And just like we talked about last week, some people don't believe that Satan is really real. Or at least he's not this malignant spiritual being. And they sort of view him, it kind of gets depressing the more I read, but there's this view of him that it's an invention of fundamental religionists that to just explain away your problems. Sort of this, the devil made me do it. Well, there is no devil. You've just created something to blame your problems on. That's what religion has done. Satan isn't real, but our problems are, and so we've just chosen a scapegoat. That's what a lot of society is slowly picking up on. But what basic society and philosophy and culture says today is that the world is not bad then because of Satan's workings, because Satan's not real. He's just a scapegoat for who you are inside. So because of that, it's actually because men haven't matured enough. So it's not that we need to be reborn. It's not that you and I need to be remade as new creatures, new creations. We just need to be re-educated. We need to grow up more. That would be the working basic philosophy in our culture then, if Satan is not really this malignant spiritual being. And that's society, that's culture, and that's definitely spread into churches today. And some people I know who are members of the Lord's church who are starting to pick up on this. Men don't need to be reborn, they need to be re-educated, and so more and more people are deciding that concepts like Satan, like hell, like judgment can't be sustained. And again, that's definitely picked up speed in most mainline denominations today. They no longer hold to those views because the idea is repulsive to them about the lostness of men. And again, there's some humorous videos you can watch of certain denominations and the things that they teach there. But more and more they're saying, well, man isn't lost, right? They don't like that idea. They don't like the idea that there is a hell and that there is a judgment that will send many people to that hell. They don't like that idea. It's repulsive. They're repulsed by this exclusive doctrine that the only way to be saved, the only way to not go to hell, is through Christ alone. And so the fact that we would announce that people without Jesus are lost and in danger of judgment and being sent to hell, it's exclusive and it's judgmental, right? And they don't want to hear that. So if you get rid of the idea of hell and you get rid of the idea of atonement to be saved, then you don't need a devil anymore. There's no hell. There's no judgment. You're fine. No need to change. There's no one to blame anything on. There's no scapegoat. No devil. And that's made it difficult, because then how does a church strategically address evil in the world then? There's no lostness, there's no devil, no judgment, no hell. Then what are we doing, and how do we fight that? That they have no plan for spiritual warfare, because they don't think there is any. But obviously there's another side to that. If the evil in the world isn't because men have not evolved enough, we just haven't figured it out yet. Right? Kind of, again, we get into where does morality come from, and if it's just majority rule, then, well, we just haven't figured it out yet. All these centuries long ago, the majority is still trying to figure out where morality is. But if evil in the world is not because men haven't evolved enough, if it's not because men haven't learned enough, if there is evil in the world because there is a real spiritual being, then all of the education and legislation and voting in the world is not going to get rid of evil. And I think it's pretty fair at this point in human history to call it and say, it's probably not that men just aren't educated enough or haven't figured the right spot. I think it's much more likely then that there is a spiritual being, that there is the devil, that is having quite a big effect. And obviously, once you get into the Bible, the biblical witness points to a spiritual enemy as the explanation for evil. It's pretty clear. Human beings did not invent evil, and I know that word is used, right, when God destroys the world with the flood, their constant invention of evil. I think of it more as with God's creation, and how you and I don't create today, we craft with what God has created. I think it's similar here, where evil comes from a malevolent spiritual being, and man crafts with it. Humans did not invent evil, and humans cannot eradicate it, which is a scary thought. But if you think that just through education and maturing and legislation we can get rid of this devil character and get rid of the evil, then you're ultimately making a mockery of God. 1 John chapter 3, verse 8. There's two things in 1 John chapter 3, verse 8 here. Jesus appeared that he might destroy the works of the devil. So you can say, we're going to educate ourselves out of evil. We're going to legislate evil out. We will destroy the devil and his schemes through those things. It's not going to work. And by attempting that, there's a mockery of Jesus here, who appeared so that he could destroy the works of the devil. Again, we have this cause and effect of, if you and I can destroy evil, then there's no need for Jesus. 1 John chapter 3, verse 8 also says, and this is where we start getting into other things here. 1 John 3, 8 also says, the devil has sinned from the beginning. So that raises maybe some questions about the beginning and sin here. Where can we trace sin back to?
To the garden.
Okay, to the garden, right? We just read that.
Trace it back further than that.
Sounds like it.
Sin started in, if you want to say heaven or where God resides, that's where it
Yeah, kind of a spiritual realm at the very least.
actually verified.
Yeah. You and I can trace back to, thanks to Romans, right, and Genesis, we can trace back to sin enters the world, and man, through one man, sin and death come to all. But 1 John 3 verse 8 says, the devil's been sinning from the beginning. And there's this idea then that sin's origin doesn't trace itself, its origin doesn't trace itself to man. It's traced back to a malevolent being. And, biblical witness blames him for the way things are. Which, I know we're in Genesis chapter 3, and we're not really there in the text. We're looking at 1 John instead, and so on. We'll look at some Old Testament stuff this morning, too. But what we're seeing in Genesis chapter 3 is sort of a... I don't know the right word for it, sort of a reinvigoration for Satan to try his hand at something again. So you and I can trace back the entering of sin and death through man beyond to today. But according to 1 John 3:8, evil can be traced back to, and sinning can be traced back to the beginning, specifically with the devil. So there's the new question. So then when did Satan start to sin? Well, part of answering that question would be answering the other question, where did Satan come from? Which, as I mentioned at the beginning, I can offer you some scripture. I can offer you a lot of speculation. You could probably offer me some speculation as well. So I can't or won't be super dogmatic with my response. But as we should with anything else, we'll do our best and discuss these things the best that we can. But there's certainly a level of speculation here for us. We talked about one possibility last week, because I'll give you three possibilities of where Satan comes from. And the first one is that God and Satan are co-equal and co-eternal realities. We talked about that last week. That's one possibility. Satan and God are co-equals, co-eternal realities. And, as we discussed last week, a lot of people would believe that, but there's not any support for that in Scripture. Again, it's just I think it's sort of a weak argument for, well, we have this ultimate good and this ultimate bad, and one is just as strong as the other. But when we start thinking of things that way, if that's true, and Satan is just as powerful and co-equal with God, then what is our assurance at all that God is going to win? If it's anyone's game, one is just as strong as the other, one is just as omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent as the other, then it sounds like it's anyone's game. And there's really not a whole lot of assurance there then. So perhaps that first possibility doesn't quite work out, that Satan and God are equal. So then what's another possibility? Well, God created Satan. Are you with me so far? We could probably agree with that. I would say he would have had to, because God is the only one, right? So God, as far as creation goes, right? So God must have created Satan. Plausible. God created Satan as an evil spirit. Ooh, I'm not so sure about that. I think now we're starting to get into certainly some questionable things there. I have a problem with that. You probably have a problem with. God created Satan, absolutely. God created Satan to have sort of an arch nemesis. No, I don't think that works. We could go through a myriad of scripture here about how God is light. God cannot have fellowship with the darkness at all. God can't have anything to do with evil. Everything that God makes is good. We could go on and on and on. And so this second possibility that God created Satan, yes, but God created Satan to be evil to make things more interesting, I'm not with that. Also, right, you can go back to the book of James, where James is writing to Christians who feel that way. Right, we talked a little bit about, God made me this way. We still do this today. God made me, homosexual, or he made me to have this proclivity for this sin or for that sin, and so how can it be evil? How can it be wrong if God made me, and that includes my mind and the things that I enjoy? Then how can those things be evil or wrong? Well, because God doesn't create darkness, he doesn't create evil. That's not from him. He has no relationship with that, wants no relationship with that. God is light. He has no fellowship with darkness. So, second possibility. So the first one's way out there, that God and Satan are co-equal. Absolutely not. There's no scriptural backing for that. So how about the second one, that God created Satan and he created Satan evil as he is? I don't think that works either. So then we narrow it down to perhaps a third possibility, which is maybe the most plausible, is that God created Satan. We're sticking with that one because I think that one's more than fair. God created Satan as good, but Satan makes a personal choice. We call that rebellion, among other things. Satan was good and makes a choice against his maker. That one I can get behind. I think there's something there to that. Again, we can certainly piece together that Satan was made by God, so was everyone else. So I'm with you there. Don't think he was made evil, because God is light and has no relationship with darkness, so he must have been good, which means Satan must have changed. Satan's done something. So then we need to get into that a little bit. Job 38 here in just a moment. Yep.
Well, he creates us free moral agents to do as he please. And I feel like Satan was like that. He created good and he made the choice to go bad.
Yeah. We start getting into spiritual stuff, which is really hard for us to wrap our heads around. But it's interesting that, and I'll say this, what we study in Genesis chapter 1, we are studying God's creation of material universe. And we know that he's made man, and when we talked about the garden and the trees, he's given man free will. It's harder for us to wrap our heads around before God creates material universe, there was more that he created first. And then it gets even wilder when you consider that Satan was likely a part of that and also has free will. So it's interesting that God has created before and has created free will as a part of that before. It's pretty wild.
Well, and to confirm that sin started in the heavenly realms, whatever you want to call it,
Whatever.
Revelation 5, verse 3 confirms that it started there, because when the scroll was given to the Lamb, there is no book that says, and no one in heaven on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll and look into it. What does that say? That's confirming that even the angels in heaven have sinned, because there was no one other than Jesus who could open the scroll.
Yeah. It's probably not something you catch the first time through, but
That's
yeah.
confirmation that sin for us started in the garden, but Genesis also confirms that sin existed before the fall of man.
Yeah. Look at this really quick. Job chapter 38. I can't give you the whole context for Job here because it's a lot of 37 chapters to summarize for you. But God is rebuking Job for his arrogance, essentially. And the question God starts putting to Job over and over is, where were you when I did this? Hey, Job, where were you when I did this? Right? Sort of speaking to Job's arrogance there. And one of the things God says is, Job, where were you when I laid out the foundation of the world, material universe? Where were you when I did that? When I did this and this? And then he says in verse 7 of Job 38, when all the sons of God shouted for joy. And if you have, I don't know what version you might be reading from, New International Version said, and all the angels rejoiced. You might have sons of glory, you might have, or sons of God, you might have angels. There's a few places we could go, but there, God is saying to Job, where were you when I laid out material universe and the angels were rejoicing? So here is some biblical proof beyond that of there was more than just, at the time this is happening. There's an angelic host before God even creates material universe for you and I. There's angelic hosts there. Yeah.
Let's focus on the phrase Son of God for a second. It's not only confirmed there, but also in Job 1:6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan was among them. Okay, so let's focus on sons of God for a minute. What does that imply? That implies God created. May not be in the same terms as how humans are born, but it confirms that in whatever capacity God created them, that included Satan.
Yeah, absolutely. Bear with me on these. But we're going to look at two things from the Old Testament. The first one's in Ezekiel 28, if you want to beat me there. Ezekiel 28. So let me try and explain this, because I think it's a decent thought. You might think this is all for naught, and that's fine. But we're going to look at prophecies of evil foreign kings. These are prophecies about kings that are coming, and the ones we're going to look at are evil kings. And that's the primary interpretation of the verses we're going to read. It's talking about these evil foreign kings that will eventually come. But just something to consider. And like I said, you may disagree with this entirely, and if so, just toss it out, right? But oftentimes in the Old Testament, there will be a prophecy of this great good king who's going to come, this historical figure who's going to do good things. But in those prophecies, there is a double meaning, a second meaning behind it, talking about the coming of Christ. We don't have time to go through all of them, but 2 Samuel 7 and Isaiah 7 are examples of the coming of good kings, but there's a deeper meaning to that prophecy as well, talking about the coming of Christ. So I wonder if you can have a prophecy about a good king that is also a second meaning pointing to the coming of Christ. Is it possible you can have a prophecy about a bad king and it also have a second meaning? So we're going to look at two really quick. Passages, prophecies about evil kings that maybe have something deeper to them, maybe not. But in Ezekiel chapter 28, if you're there, we have a prophecy against the king of Tyre. But then verses 11 through 17, moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, raise a lamentation over the king of Tyre, and say to him, Thus says the Lord God, You were the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, sardius, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, emerald, carbuncle, and crafted in gold were your settings and your engravings. On the day that you were created, they were prepared. You were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till unrighteousness was found in you. In the abundance of your trade you were filled with violence in your midst, and you sinned. So I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I exposed you before kings to feast their eyes on you. This is the prophecy of the king of Tyre, but some of those descriptions are pretty telling of someone else, right? A seal of perfection, full of wisdom, perfect in beauty, a guardian cherub in the garden of God, one who's given a very high position, and all these beautiful gems. There's this imagery, right, of all these gems anyways. Created blameless, but the verbiage there is, but you made a trade. Blameless, perfect as you were, you make a trade. There's pride, you've become enamored with yourself, and as a result, in verse 16, God says, and I cast you down from this mountain. I cast you to the ground and exposed you. This is a pretty, it's symbolic, it's descriptive of a man, of the king of Tyre, but I think it's certainly possible that this is referring to a malevolent spirit working through the king of Tyre. I think there's a little bit more to what's being said here than just this bad man that's coming, right? Isaiah chapter 14. Let's see if I can get there. Let's look at another one. This is about the king of Babylon. But again, as we're reading about the king of Babylon, it feels like more than just the king of Babylon is being talked about here. Verses 12 through 15. Hard you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. I'm not saying it isn't possible for a man to aspire to something so ridiculous as this. But part of that language, and like I said, in the Old Testament, we do this with good kings, where it's talking about this good king, but it's descriptive of the coming of Christ eventually, right? Why can't it be the same with these bad kings, where it's talking about real kings, the king of Tyre, the king of Babylon, but some of the descriptive language here seems to be a double reference to the devil? Because some of this language is too grand for men, to a degree. And you probably, in verse 12 there, maybe you've heard that before. How you have fallen from heaven, O day star. And you might be thinking, where have I heard that before? Luke 10, verse 18, about Satan falling from heaven. That is the reference there. So when we talk about what does the Bible tell us about where Satan comes from, that's usually the verse people go to, Satan falling from heaven. Luke chapter 10, verse 18, that one's an easy one to kind of pull out. So maybe in this description here in Isaiah 14 of the king of Babylon, it's referenced later in Luke 10. A couple things about this passage as we kind of get close to closing here a little bit. There's a desire to ascend to God's place. Not next to, not near. There is a desire to knock God off and be put in his place. This being here doesn't just want to be the highest of the stars of God. He wants to take place of God. And there's fivefold repetition. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly, on the utmost heights of the sacred mountain. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself the Most High. And I'm not saying an earthly king can't aspire to that or say those things, but I think it certainly speaks to something or someone much more evil. So here's my conclusion. And like I said, you might feel like I haven't hardly answered anything, and that's fine. And again, I'm not being dogmatic about it because this is a tough question to answer to a degree. But I think it's reasonable that God created, I think that's more than reasonable. I think you and I can all agree on that. God created a special, an angelic host, special creatures. And in this case, there is a guardian cherub, and this cherub desired the worship and the dominion of his creator. I want that job. Well, I shouldn't say it that way because we're going to read something here in a moment. But he had a desire to take the place of God. Not to be among the Most High, but to be the Most High. And this special creature has considerable skills of persuasion, to twist others and to recruit others. And so it's not just Satan, right? 2 Peter 2:4, for if God did not spare angels when they sinned, so it's not just Satan, right? Satan certainly, right, is the beginning, but other angels are sinning, and that's certainly because of Satan and his considerable skills of persuasion. So if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell, and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment. Jude chapter 6. And angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, he has kept in eternal bonds under the darkness for the judgment of the great day. Satan is a part of this angelic host, and he has this desire to become the Most High, and he uses his skills of persuasion to recruit others to join him in what he's trying to do. And there's a revolt. Again, it's kind of hard to wrap our heads around. What does that even look like, right? But there's this rebellion, there's this revolt, and you and I know that it's quite unsuccessful, but it happens. It happened. And this cherub's or Satan's signal sin, if that matters to you at all, is pride. Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 6, it's no light matter. He's talking about the qualifications of elders, and he says, a man must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall into the same judgment as the devil. Paul says that Satan comes under the judgment ultimately that he does because of his pride. He's conceited and wants the Most High. And there's danger for you and I of having that similar pride. Paul says, Timothy, look, when you're putting elders into place, it can't be a recent convert, which is something else we can talk about as well. The fact that it's any one of us can have pride, but the fact that Paul says it can't be a recent convert, otherwise they might become conceited, which will result in the same judgment as the devil. And if we go with that conclusion, if Satan is a created being of God who was good but rebels against God because of pride, and then that leads to a pretty important implication here. And that means Satan as a created being, and we've already talked about this, I know, but Satan being a created being then is not co-equal to God. He's not. God made him, and so instantly, just based off of that, he can't be co-equal with God. Yeah.
Starting in verse 7. Now war arose in death, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them to come. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil, Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him.
Yep.
Continues in verse 11, saying that they were conquered by the Lord of the Lamb.
Yeah. When we were going through the class in Revelation, and that's what Dustin's referring to, going through the class of Revelation, what did we find over and over about the devil? Loser, loser, loser. You would talk to me and tell me that Satan is co-equal with God. He's a 3-time loser. He just continues to lose. Satan is not omnipresent. He's not omniscient. He's not omnipotent. That doesn't mean that he's given up, and that doesn't mean that he should be underestimated. Because again, we're dealing with creatures made before you and I. And we talked about that vaguely last week, but you and I don't get to say, well, if he's not on par with God, neither am I. So why is he something to be afraid of? No, he's still something to be afraid of. We're talking about a being created before material universe who chose to rebel against God and is convincing enough that he's gotten other angelic parts of the angelic host to join him. That's a big deal.
Well,
Yeah.
and the point too is that he hates you, he just wants you to be destroyed with him. And that's his only purpose.
Yeah.
And you're given the choice to either go with him or go with Christ.
Right. He's more than happy to just bring people down with him.
But he hates that we have that opportunity
Yeah.
because he does not.
Let me end with this, because I think this is super neat. According to Isaiah, the devil says something to this effect: I will make myself like the Most High, right? If we're referring to Isaiah 14, the king of Babylon, and if we're saying that there's double meaning here, and this is talking about a malevolent spiritual force saying, I will make myself like the Most High, the Hebrew there being Elyon, E-L space Y-O-N. And you remember when we talked about Hagar and how she is the first to name God. And what does she name God? Does anyone remember? The God who sees me. Well, that's the first name, but God has a bunch. And Elyon is one of those, and that is the Most High. And Isaiah chapter 14 points to this malevolent being saying, I want that name. I want to be the Most High. And the reason I think that's scary, but the reason I think that's neat is because the first time that name is used of God in the Bible is in the story of Abraham and Melchizedek in Genesis 14. Melchizedek says, Blessed be Abraham of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. Melchizedek calls God Elyon, the Most High, possessor. He possesses heaven and earth. And so it's interesting then when you consider Isaiah chapter 14, both talking about the king of Babylon, but additionally the malevolent spiritual creature, Satan, saying, that's what I want. That's what I want. And maybe I'm taking too much creative liberty with this. Satan never says, I want to be the comforter. I want to be the shepherd. I want to be the father. I want to be the God who sees the downtrodden. Satan doesn't ask to be any of those things. He says, I want to be Elyon. I want to be the Most High. I want to possess heaven, and I want to possess earth. He doesn't want all those other names. Not interested in that stuff. He wants to be the Most High. He wants to possess all things. The only name of God that Satan ever says he wants is the Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth. And he leads a revolt, and he tries to possess, again, heaven or spiritual realm, whatever we want to call it at that time, and he fails miserably. He's removed. He is sent to the ground. And what you see in Genesis chapter 3, like I said, we talked about Genesis things, but we didn't look at Genesis. But what you see in Genesis chapter 3 is his ambition renewed. There's this whole history before material universe that we vaguely know very little about, right? He's cast down to the ground. He fails. And now in Genesis chapter 3, we have material universe, and God makes man. And the devil says, okay. here's someone else. Here's something else. Let's try this. He fails to take heavenly realm, and so, hey, look at this new thing, this earth. I'm going to try and take that. And he wastes no time working on Eve and Adam. Satan is real, and he's quite powerful and cunning and convincing. He is still doing things beyond what you and I necessarily can do. So he's not to be underestimated, but he has been defeated. Christ has crushed the serpent's head, but even though he's defeated, he's still dangerous and he's still deadly, and thus you and I are still defending ourselves from his scheme. Of course, with the help of Christ, but you and I are still at a fight for those things, so that we don't fall prey to him and are ultimately destroyed. Is that an answer? Is that a non-answer to the question, where did Satan come from? Maybe I'll let you decide. But those are some thoughts this morning. We're pretty much out of time, but are there anything else? Comments or stuff? Okay, thank you guys.